Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope you're all ready for some adventure, because we're going to travel through time and space and learn more about the Valdivia expedition and the many different animals and marine life that they discovered. We will also introduce the Valdivia crew to data competences and show them how this can make their life so much easier, and possibly all of ours as well. So the Valdivia deep sea expedition took place at the end of the 19th century, and it traveled from Hamburg to the Atlantic, Antarctic, and Indian Ocean. The goal of the expedition was to figure out whether there's marine life below 900 meters of depth. And the answer is yes, there's quite a lot of life there. In fact, the researchers managed to describe more than 4,500 species. And the results of such expedition were collected in a series of books. The first of which was published relatively early, in 1902, so just 3 years after they came back, which is quite impressive. But it's also impressive that the last book was instead published in 1940, 4 decades after they came back with all this material from their journey around the world, which is quite shocking. But there are some good reasons for it. So let's discover them. Why did it take so long? Well, first things first, the amount of samples and specimens that they collected was so enormous that we still don't know exactly how much it was. Probably in the order of, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of jars. And each jar can contain 100 small crabs or shrimps or other things like that. And these things were also spread out throughout Germany because they were sent to the different experts to identify them. They didn't only have actual physical specimens, but they also collected a lot of printed material, or paper material rather. They kept journals, they had data sheets, they took a lot of pictures. They were the first ones to actually took pictures of icebergs, for example. You can see one there. And they also exchanged letters with Germany back and forth. So there's just an enormous amount of material and not a really good way to connect the specimen to the material, to the letters, and all of that thousands and thousands of things spread out through a country or even different countries. So it makes sense that it got quite confusing and it took them some time to really sort through everything, or more or less everything. Let's see. So what they didn't really do is they didn't really look beyond now, beyond the present. They were very focused on how do we do the expedition, which, to be fair, they did very well. Everything went smoothly and they got great results. But they didn't think of the generations of scientists that would follow and that would like to use this fantastic material that they brought back. But why they didn't do it, it's hard to tell. Perhaps it was just not as important back then, or perhaps they lacked the skills to really think this through and also store the material and store the data so that other people could use it. But that's why the Vinoda Knowledge Lab, our project, comes to the rescue. So I promise that we will travel through time, so that's what we'll do next. And we will go back to the 19th century and bring them data competences. And if we tell the crew of the boat that these things can make their life much easier and make their work lighter, I'm pretty sure they would be quite interested. And they would wonder, like, that sounds pretty cool, but what is it exactly and what can we do with them now that we're on a boat or later when we're back in Germany? So we have quite a few examples. And we can start with some of the problems that actually arise in the field. So they had some nets, like this one, brought a small model. And with these nets, you can dump them in the water and you collect something. So let's see what we have. Okay. So we have a crab. It's a deep sea crab. And the species is Patinactes. We're experts, so we kind of know, I guess. We also have to write down the location, and we wrote down Station 71, which is one of the many points in which our boat stopped along the journey. And the date is January 5th, 1899. That's great. Then our colleague takes over, and they get the same crab, or the same species, rather. So they also know the species, because they're also an expert, but for the location, they write something different. As before with Kelvins and Celsius, here we have, well, Station 71, or very precise coordinates. They didn't really agree how to fill these data sheets. And that's quite normal nowadays as well. For the date as well, there's a different format. This is a short format. And a lot of issues come when we want to put this data set together, even if we don't have to train an AI, but just simply have a data sheet that is clean and that you can use. You need to convert a lot of things, and that takes a lot of time and is very prone to mistakes. A second series of problems in the field happens when you put the specimen in jars, because the jars actually came with pre-printed labels at the end of the 19th century, which had the same information as there: species, place, and date. And then you put your crab there, and it's nice and stored. But then your colleague also put a crab of the same species in another jar, which has the same information as the first jar. So there's no real way to distinguish the two jars, because you don't have a unique identifier, something that really tells you crab 1 is the one on top and crab 2 is the one on the bottom. You cannot really go back to the data set and say, oh, it was this one or that one. You created a problem, unfortunately. But that's something we can solve with data competences, and particularly with data standards, for example, which is something that doesn't even require technology. It's literally just agreeing together how do we store our data and our metadata, which formats, which units of measure, and so on. So here about an example of something called Darwin Core, which is a data standard for biological data. And the first thing you can see, occurrence ID, also solves our jar problem, because it's mandatory that you have a unique identifier. So we call, for example, the crab number 1, Vald, like Valdivia, Bat, because you know it's a Batinectes, and it's the first crab of that day. So you write that down, then you agree, we write longitude and latitude in degrees, scientific name, and the date. You can also write much more, and it would be recommendable to write much more, but if you're in a rush and you really want to just get the core information there, this is the minimum for this standard, and can be done pretty easily. A second series of questions, or issues rather, happens when you're back after the expedition. So you brought back to Germany this gigantic amount of material. You have a lot of journals, you have a lot of things you wrote down, and you have a lot of specimens to sort through and compare with things that were previously described, perhaps elsewhere. And that, of course, took a very long time. So here we have two more technological data competences that can be applied, that can make things very nice and smooth, or more or less, more smoother than doing them by hand, let's say. So one thing would be AI text recognition, which is something that is very recent. They are developing an AI pipeline, for example, at the Museum for Naturkunde, where you can get metadata or data from handwritten or printed labels, like institution, species, and location, for example. And for the identification of the species, instead, you can compare what you have with digitized specimens, which means specimens where they took pictures, perhaps from different angles, or even 3D models where you can really see the details of the different animals. And there, of course, it's much easier to compare. You don't have to look at a drawing that was made, I don't know, 20 years before in a different continent, but you can actually compare much more and see if the species have been described or not, and then sort through things much faster. And these are just a couple of examples, because, of course, data competence are many, and they can be applied to many different fields of expeditions and biological research. So what have we learned from this encounter of 21st century data skills with 19th century naturalists? Well, that data competences are pretty important. Organizing data, storage of information is fundamental, because, for example, from this exact expedition, we still have material that has never been looked at. We have some jars that are still closed from the 19th century, and they are getting dust somewhere in the museum. And that's because they can't really reconstruct which jar exactly is it, when was it taken, was it in Leipzig, was it there? Like, it's too confusing, and yeah, they are really lacking information, which is a shame. Another important point is that a lot of the things that are described are still happening nowadays, in the field in particular. So, for example, when I was doing my PhD, I also wrote down my data on pieces of paper, and then I spent countless hours bringing it into a computer, there typing, which of course can happen then can lead to a lot of mistakes, or just things need to be done twice, and also gets quite confusing. So, in conclusion, if you are a researcher that works either in the field or in a museum, please really consider developing and using your data skills to really extract the maximum information and use these materials, which have a huge potential. And if you're not sure where to start, well, you can join our trainings, and we can learn together. We will be very happy to do so. Thank you.